Dead Cells is one of the most iconic games in the roguelike genre. Really, it has over 110,000 reviews on Steam, with the verdict being overwhelmingly positive with a 97% positive review score. When you think of some of the greatest roguelike games, hell, some of the greatest games of all time, they struggle to keep a review score that high. Other roguelike games that have an impressive score like this are few and far between, but some games with those types of review numbers with a positive score are considered some of the greatest roguelites of all time. We have Hades with over 200,000 reviews, Binding of Isaac as well with over 200,000 reviews, Risk of Rain 2 with over 150,000, and Vampire Survivors with also over 150,000. Really, all those games are considered some of the greatest in this genre, and they're considered that for good reason. But then we have Dead Cells. Is it also considered one of the greatest roguelites of all time? Granted, reviews don't mean too much as everybody has different personal opinions on what their favorite games are, but there's also a lot more that goes into a great game with replayability, story, the ins and outs of a roguelite run. There's so many things that play into this aspect. Obviously, it is considered one of the greatest in moderation, that isn't a question, but I want to talk about my experience with Dead Cells. I've only ever talked about Dead Cells in 2 tier list videos and have it mentioned in my greatest games of all time video, but I've always wanted to make a more in-depth video on Dead Cells as I love this game, and I do think it could be one of the greatest roguelites of all time. Hell, it's one of the greatest games of all time for me. So let's talk everything Dead Cells right now. Before we talk about the ins and outs of a run and all the amazing variety that this game offers, let's talk about the creators of this game, Motion Twin. This group of developers may be the most interesting group of devs I've ever seen. It's a small team of 7 people who are all paid the same salary as they don't have a boss, according to their website, and they've been making games for over 20 years, with games ranging all over the place, with most games being browser games or mobile games that can be played for free on their website. Or they could be played for free as Adobe Flash Player is no longer supported, so you can't really play them. But their most popular games were Mush, Die Tonight, My Brute, and then a Nintendo DS game called Alpha Bounce. But of course, Dead Cells turned out to be their largest game, and it really had quite the development cycle. At first, Dead Cells was going to be a follow-up to the game Die Tonight, which was a multiplayer tower defense game that was initially released in 2008. But after some testing, Motion Twin decided that the follow-up they were working on wasn't an exciting and a multiplayer experience, so they stripped the game down to a single-player experience. And this was all in 2014, and they took their idea to a convention called the Big Indie Pitch, which is where indie developers engage in a speed dating style of pitching their game. And they've had a lot of events throughout the past years, but it's really only for indie developers, so someone like me, I can't go to them, but it does seem very cool. And looking at past years on the site, I don't really recognize any games from the list besides a couple here and there, but this is a great way to find new indie games. But back to Dead Cells. At this time, the game had 2 phases with preparation and combat, but Motion Twin decided to remove the preparation aspect of the game and focus the game around constant action, and learning these combat elements took the team all the way to the end of 2015 to learn. And obviously at this point the game still has a lot of change for us to recognize what we know today, and they gain inspiration from the engineer in Team Fortress 2, where you have buildable objects and turrets to give your own character a buff. And after that, Motion Twin decided to remake the game into an action platformer, which is what we know it as today. At this point, we're starting to recognize the game, and they planned on throwing the game into Steam Early Access in 2017. But before Early Access, a developer at Motion Twin cited that the Binding of Isaac was another major influence to highlight item-driven runs for the players and keep the variety of the game high, whereas the player does not rely on a single item. Those are the creators of the game, and I felt like that was a jumboed mess, but I found all the information I kinda could. But there's still a lot to talk about once the game gets into Early Access and beyond. Dead Cells initially launched into Early Access on Steam on May 10th of 2017, and then released on the GOG.com in November of 2017, with it still being in Early Access. Early Access lasted a little over a year, with the game fully launching on August 7th, 2018 on PC, Xbox One, PS4, and Nintendo Switch. And then surprisingly, the game had a retail copy available in the same month. You don't really see a lot of indie games get physical copies at all, let alone the same month that they release into 1.0. So this game was popular. I will say it's justified, as the game sold over 850,000 copies before its full release, and as of March 2021, it sold over 5 million copies total. One of the best-selling indie games I've ever seen. Oh, also, the game released on iOS on August 28th, 2019, and then again on Android on June 3rd, 2020. So you can play this game literally everywhere. And then finally, the last thing to talk about in this monstrous game is probably the biggest thing that this game has, and it's all the crazy amount of DLC that's available. If you don't know, Dead Cells received received 4 paid DLCs and 1 free DLC. Their first DLC was Rise of the Giant, which added 2 new levels and 2 more bosses, and it released March 28th of 2019. Next DLC was the first paid one with the Bad Seed, which added 2 new biomes, new bosses, and a lot of new weapons and game mechanics, and it released on February 11th of 2020, and it cost about $4 US, which as of today is the price for all of the DLCs minus the latest one. Now the second of 4 paid DLCs was the Fatal Falls update, which added 2 new levels and a new boss along with a lot of new lore. It got released January 26th, 2021. Then the third paid DLC was the Queen and the Sea, which added a lot of endgame content to make a run a lot harder with 3 new endgame levels, new weapons, new outfit, you know, the usual things. And it released January 6th of 2022. And then finally, the latest DLC dropped I feel was probably the most anticipated DLC, and it was the return to Castlevania, which added 2 new biomes, 3 bosses, 20 outfits, new weapons, new story, new enemies, and new music tracks, which are all directly inspired behind Castlevania, and it released March 6th of 2023. And outside of that Castlevania DLC, Dead Cells probably has the most collaborations I've ever seen in a game, if we're not counting like Fall Guys and Fortnite. They've had 2 different updates that have added tons of different references from other indie games, with the first update in making references to Hyper Light Drifter, Guacamelee, Curse of the Dead Gods, Blasphemous, Skull the Hero Slayer, and Hollow Knight. And that was all in 1 free update. The second free update was filled with collabs with Terraria, Hotline Miami, Slay the Spire, Shovel Knight, Risk of Rain, and Katana Zero. Really, the creation of Dead Cells as a whole, the long development cycle, the transformation the game has gone through so many different times throughout the years, on top of all the incredible paid DLC that the game offers, the incredible collaborations with other indie games, that alone can make it one of the greatest roguelites you've ever seen. But what really matters is how the game works on the inside. So now, let's get into that. First thing to do, as always, is talk about everything inside of a run, and really everything is inside of a run in Dead Cells. All the usual things you'd expect from outside of a run, like meta progression for unlocks or NPCs to talk to, all of that is inside of a run. Well, unless you count changing outfits and minimal things like that, but that stuff that really changes the game all happens within. You play as the prisoner, who's a silent protagonist, and travel through multiple levels fighting mutated enemies from the island of where you're from, I guess. If you read the lore, you learn that where the game is located is an unknown island, and a disease called the malaise infected all the people on the island, and they're the monsters that you fight. You start every run with some basic weapons and have 3 different attributes you need to level up with: brutality, tactics, and survival, with all weapons, items, and mutations having a color to show what type of build it benefits. Every single stage you have as well will have a set number of scrolls you can find, and the scrolls will enhance the power of whatever attribute you want and increase your health. Every biome as well has different shops that sell you weapons, items, or in certain levels you can buy health items. You're able to hold 2 items that also have different colors associated with them to determine what type of build they benefit. Really, that's all the most basic things you have in a run, and it's a little overwhelming at first, but man, once you learn it and discover so many secrets, it can really suck you into the game. And then that's not even talking about the combat of a run or the length of a run. So a run is about 7 stages long, with a few bonus stages and 3 boss fights, or 4 depending on what path you take. One of my favorite things with the game is the map that shows what levels connect with what. It allows you to easily decide which levels you want to explore for the run, and depending on what levels you do, you can fight new bosses every single time. You will eventually fight all the bosses, so it's not technically new, but with how easy it is to pick a path for the runs, it always ends up feeling fresh, especially with the amount of items in the game, but we'll get there soon. Obviously, if you want all this different variety, you need to pay for the DLCs, but I'll tell you, those DLCs are 100% worth it, and if you don't feel like buying them, you still get a good amount of variety with the base game of Dead Cells. The DLC just enhances it tenfold in my opinion. But inside of every biome, you will fight a handful of enemies and collect cells. The cells are very important, as if you die, you lose all the cells currently being carried, but the cells allow you to upgrade and unlock everything. You can unlock weapons and items once you find their blueprints, unlock new outfits, unlock mutations once you find their blueprints, and mutations are basically just buffs that last your entire run. After every level, you get to choose 1 mutation, but you only get 3 mutations per run. And then finally, most importantly, the cells allow you to unlock permanent upgrades like a backpack, a better options for starting weapons, and most importantly, the ability to hold more health flask. Really, I just love this upgrade system. It makes you want to fight every single enemy that you can see, and it makes sure you play very carefully if you are close to death, because you don't want to lose all the cells that you have gained. And if you don't know, Dead Cells is a very brutal game when it comes to healing items. When you first start the game out, you get 1 flask, which heals most of your health, and with cells, you can unlock up to 3 more flasks, so you get 4 total level in the end, but on a basic run, you can refill your flask back up to full after every level, so 4 flasks per level, which isn't too bad. But outside of flask, your only way of healing is from finding chickens or kebabs, which heal you a little bit, and they sometimes pop out of random enemies and levels, or a mutation that has lifesteal, or a weapon that has lifesteal. Now, I'll say every level is guaranteed to get like 1 or 2 health items. I think it's 1 health item guaranteed. And then the lifesteal, it's okay, but I've never been able to fully break it, so to speak. I've never really tried to break anything in this game. But the healing, it's pretty good if you don't add any difficulty enhancers. But the game is still very hard. A run can last an hour or so like in typical roguelite fashion, but where the game shines the best in my opinion is the item variety. And where on earth do I even begin with the crazy amount of variety in this game? Well, I guess we can start with the weapons. Like every amazing roguelite I've played, Dead Cells has some of the best weapons and item variety I've ever seen. It reminds me of some other great roguelites like Enter the Gungeon, which I absolutely love. That Gungeon never filled it out fully, but god dang I was close. Or the Binding of Isaac, which probably has the most weapons and items you've ever seen. But I'll say the unlock method for a large amount of items in this game, where you need to use the cells to unlock them, that is so much more fun than me than spending some boss currency you get like in Enter the Gungeon, or just winning a run like in Binding of Isaac. The cell system for the meta progression, it's perfection. But where Dead Cells is also a little more unique with items is the modifiers that weapons can have, and how easy it is to change the modifiers in a run. Every weapon has its own unique thing about it, but every weapon can also have additional modifiers and be upgraded to a higher quality. And to my knowledge, upgrading to a higher quality will allow you to have more modifiers than before. And the modifiers are also very nice. Extra damage to any of the many status effects, whether it be burning, frozen enemies, stunned enemies, rooted enemies, poisoned. You can shoot arrows in different directions when you use whatever weapon you're using. Extra damage as a whole. Really, there's way too many modifiers for me to name them all. Then there's still so much more related to modifiers, like finding legendary items that are colorless. Legendary items can have their own unique affixes on them that only spawn on the legendary weapons. It's just so much to talk about it. I love all the different weapon options in this game. I don't even know how many weapons and items there are in the game, but you can see them all in the beginning of a run and see if you have them all. And even with my good amount of time, I'm still missing a lot of them. Really, all the items and all the different build options make every single run feel so unique. Now, I also feel like I've barely touched on mutations, but also feel like there isn't too much to discuss with them as a whole. Like weapons, the mutations all have different colors with green, purple, and red, all benefiting the type of build you're running. And then of course colorless, which is just a general buff. And I just want to say, like items, there are a lot of mutations, and even 80 hours in, I'm still unlocking new ones and discovering how to make an optimal build around certain mutations. I just love how addicting and fun it is to get all these different types of builds in Dead Cells. When I first started playing Dead Cells, I was trying to even out the scrolls, trying to get all the colors even. Little did I know that was not the way to do it. But once I figured out that you want to go for one certain trait, oh my goodness, it was a game changer. The game is just incredible with all these items and mutations. Now, I would talk about the enemy variety, but what else can I say already that I didn't say inside of a run? Well, for starters, every area has their own enemies. Every boss has a fun, unique moveset that takes a lot of time to master, and after hours and hours of playing, you might be able to beat a boss without taking damage. The enemy design and difficulty scaling is just so well, and the difficulty of bosses just feels so perfect. But then there's something that I find not to be perfect, and it's probably the biggest downfall of Dead Cells, and it's not even a big downfall, and it's the difficulty enhancers. I love difficulty enhancers in a roguelike game, and I do think they add a lot of replayability to whatever game they're on. I still believe Hades has the best difficulty enhancers with the heat system, but a lot of games have done enhancers or New Game Plus really well, like Rogue Legacy 2 or Have a Nice Death. And it's not to say that Dead Cells has bad difficulty enhancers. In fact, I think that's the opposite. I think they're good difficulty enhancers to an extent. I love Dead Cells, and it's almost the perfect roguelike to me. But with how brutal the difficulty enhancers can be, and having the true endgame locked behind the hardest difficulty enhancer, that sets it back for me. I've had some people get a little upset with me when I'd stream this game and tell them I had no desire to try to win on 5 BC, as it didn't entice me. If you don't know, once you win in Dead Cells, you can enable boss cells, and you first unlock boss cell 1, and then to unlock 2, you need to win with 1 on, and so on and so forth. And the difficulty changes aren't too bad. Bosses change a little bit in the early phases, some new doors are opened, you can get new upgrades for better weapons with meta progression, and more enemies spawn, and may even begin teleporting at like boss cell 3. The more boss cells you have, the crazier it gets. My biggest problem with it is how little healing you receive. The biggest change of these difficulty enhancers is not allowing you to fully refill your flask after every area. Eventually, on higher difficulties, you don't even receive any flask. And if you want to play the game that that way, you can. But I'm not a fan of those giant difficulty enhancers with absolutely no healing where you need to play a perfect run if you want to win and get an absolutely busted build. I did love getting to boss cell number 4. That was my peak in Dead Cells. I got through boss cell 3, and then at 4, I did it for a few hours, and I was like, this is not as fun as it should be, so I just kind of stopped. The difficulty enhancers, they're good, but they're not great. My time with Dead Cells may not be that much compared to some people, but I really do enjoy this game and appreciate how much variety is available, how unique and fun each run feels with everything from bosses, weapons, cosmetics, patterns for the run, different builds, really everything. My only negative gripe with this game is behind the difficulty enhancers, and even then I enjoy them to an extent. Just boss cell 4 and 5 is too much for me, and hell, I've never even played 5. Just 4 is too much for me. And I've had plenty of people agree and disagree with me on it. Dead Cells is one of my favorite games of all time, and I may not play it all the time, but it's one of those games that I can always pick up and just have a good time playing, even without any difficulty enhancers on. Because even without difficulty enhancers, I can kind of struggle sometimes. I still haven't fully beat every boss 80 hours in, but I've cleared the game so much. It's one of the greatest roguelites out there, and I'd highly suggest it for anyone. I hope you enjoyed this video about Dead Cells. It's a game I've always wanted to make a video on, so here we are. I absolutely love and adore this game and really respect all the different content that's been added over the years. If you want to see more in-depth reviews or overviews of some games and how I feel about them, let me know in the comments down below. Liking and subscribe and also helps out the channel a lot. An extra special shout out to the people that support me on Patreon still. I really don't know how to say thanks more than one time, so just thank you for the support there. And yeah, thanks for your time and see you next time.